Welcome to today's Outsource Pharma Live event, which is entitled ADC Outsourcing, Plan Smart Now or Suffer Later. I'm Jeff Bogaliskas, Deputy Chief Editor at Outsource Pharma, and I'll be your host for today's event. And today's program is made possible through the support of Lonza, so a really big thank you to them for helping us keep this event free for all of our registrants. Now, if you work anywhere near antibody-drug conjugates, or ADCs as we like to call them, you already know this is not a simple find a vendor and move the work kind of modality. ADCs pull together biology, chemistry, conjugation, analytics, drug substance, drug product, supply chain, and fill finish. And each piece is complicated on its own. But put them together and compress timelines and multiple external partners, and suddenly every outsourcing decision carries a lot more weight. Now, this is exactly what we're going to try to unpack today. How sponsors decide what to outsource, what to keep closer, when to bring partners in, how to avoid building technical or operational risk into the programs before anyone realizes it. And we'll also talk about some of the realities shaping ADC outsourcing right now, from one-stop shop models and multi-vendor coordination to analytical testing, tech transfer, fill finish times, tariffs, the Biosecure Act, and possibly even some China-related risk. So I'm excited about the panel that we put together today because we have three people who bring deep complementary expertise in chemistry, manufacturing, and controls to the conversation, and they all have experience spanning from early drug discovery through to market launches. So without any ado, first up, please let me introduce our first speaker. We have Ben Hutchins, who is founder and principal consultant at First Principle CMC. Ben brings broad CMC strategy and execution experience with a practical lens on how sponsors can make better technology decisions early in development. We're also joined by Reza Oliyai, who is the president and CEO of Oliyai Consulting Corporation, or OCC. Reza brings decades of experience across CMC, product development, manufacturing strategy, and operational realities that determine whether an outsourcing plan actually works. And joined also from OCC is Simon Letarte, who is a consultant in biologic CMC analytical development. Simon brings deep analytical development experience and expertise in biologics, which is especially important for ADCs, where characterization, testing strategy, and method transfer are central to keeping programs on track. Now, before we jump into the questions, one quick note for our audience. If you have any questions for us at any time in the event, please don't hesitate, send them on in. We're going to try to take as many questions as we can from you, and we'll try to take them as soon as we see them, especially if they're on topic. But don't worry, we're going to leave a little bit of time at the end, too, to try to address some of your questions just in case we miss them or if they're maybe a little bit outside of the scope of what we're discussing. So all you need to do is type your question into the Q&A box and then hit submit. All right. Panel, let's jump in and try to get through some of these topics because we have a lot to discuss and a lot of interesting stuff. So I want to set the table. And Reza, I want to start with you with a big picture. Now, ADCs have been around for a while, but the outsourcing environment around them kind of feels different today than it did even a few years ago. So when you think about ADC outsourcing today, what's changed the most, in your opinion, in the last few years, and what's not changed nearly enough?
Yeah. Jeff, good morning, and thank you so much for the invitation to participate on this call. I think this is a great question. We can also step back and think about the source of innovation in ADC today as compared to, I would say, 5 or 10 years ago, where the source of innovation was primarily coming out of US. But now what we're seeing is the blended source of innovation for ADC development. That includes Europe, of course, US and Canada, and not a good portion coming out of Asia. And then also in the older days, we used to conduct mainly the initial clinical studies in US and Europe. But now we're seeing more and more clinical studies being conducted in places like China. The reason I want to set the stage for that, because as we think about CDMO network outsourced manufacturing, we have to think about a blended approach, because the evolution of the innovation has changed, so we have to think differently about our CDMO network. Specifically the CDMOs, over the past 5 years, I would say the capacity for production of MAP has gone up substantially. There are more and more companies, CDMOs, that could produce mAb. On the bioconjugation, still, I think there's a good deal of capacity globally available, but it's pretty tight. When it comes to fill and finish, especially for cytotoxic agent, I think that's the tightest capacity that we see globally. So the evolution has really been around more mAb capacity available, a little bit more capacity about bioconjugation, and less on fill and finish.
Bennett, did you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think I echo a lot of what Reza just said. In the last 5 years, the technology has changed a lot, right? There are new payloads are present, the underlying technology has changed, but more importantly, that global outsourcing structure has changed for us. So, working primarily with trials that are running in China right now looks pretty different than it did 5 years ago. And how do you decide how to start your product from phase one and be able to supply a study that might start there and then quickly anticipate coming to an accelerated approval in the U.S. So flip side of that is there's a substantial geopolitical risk, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit later. That means you have to think sort of in a few dimensions there, and time frame being one of them. So. I think these days, when you're starting up an ADC program, you need to be thinking about launch already. You need to be understanding what your commercial strategy will possibly be. Obviously, you're never going to commit that early, but you need to understand how you will expand when the current sort of geopolitical shifts happen underneath your feet. So I'd also add a little. There are far more ADCs out now than there used to be, and so 5 years ago, regulatory expectations were different. They were probably, the bar was quite a bit lower in that how much you had to understand. But now we understand the molecules more. We understand the control strategies more. And with each new ADC that gets approved, the challenges get better understood. But then so do the expectations in those initial filings. So I think we are moving that bar with each new product, and that means if you're a newcomer right now into the space, the bar starts a lot higher than it did for a newcomer 5-10 years ago.
All right, thanks, guys. Great way to sort of frame the shift in the landscape, and a great way to start this. Ben, stick with me. I'm going to start the next question with you. But before we move on real quickly, something I forgot to mention in the opening to the audience, because it's coming up in a second. You're going to see a few polls that are going to fire off in the background. By all means, please go ahead and address them. Answer them as best you can. That kind of helps us shape the conversation, see how you guys are thinking about stuff, and help shape future events for us. So thanks for that. So Ben, let's move from the market level into the actual ADC value chain, because the complexity can show up in different places depending on the program. So when you look at the full ADC value chain from discovery support through drug substance and fill finish, where do sponsors most often underestimate complexity?
It's a great question. So obviously I knew it ahead of time, but I like this question because it sort of hits on some of the key challenges in ADCs that are different than more standard, less complex biologics. Obviously, bioconjugation is unique to this, unique to ADCs compared to some other molecules, but that alone is a skill set that is molecule specific. So you don't just need a CDMO that knows how to do lysine conjugations. You need a CDMO that knows how to manage whatever chemistry you might throw at them and whatever unique attributes of your molecule might come out. So if you're bringing a new payload, especially, you need to trust your bioconjugation team to be able to solve that problem. And a lot of times people will assume, oh, you've conjugated before, this shouldn't be a problem. Well, every new molecule really does carry its own personality and challenges. And if you don't look at it as a unique challenge, and you really, really want platforms, you can find yourself not understanding the complexity of the conjugation step. And paired with that, I always like to throw analytical as the other aspect here that is often underlooked. It is under investigated, at least. The ADC testing menu is huge, right? You have to compare it to a standard biologic. You have to do all of that and then some, and then you have to do it 2 or 3 times over, and then show why it changed throughout that process. So the method development and transfer of all of those, the timelines associated with all that, they have to be built in, and they have to be considered as essential to the molecule timeline and success. And oftentimes when when you're working in, I do some due diligence work for folks, and when we're working in that space, a lot of times they'll look at the analytical package and say it was just enough to get there, but they won't realize that, oh, actually, I have to move this assay somewhere. I want to be able to actually confirm that the molecule will behave the same way, and that we understand the end process controls and all these things. We have to understand that when we move it somewhere new, and so understanding the analytical challenge from a bigger picture, I think, is often where the complexity gets underestimated as well.
Yeah, and I think mentioning analytical, I think it's a great way to have Simon weigh in on this. Simon, I know you have a lot of experience there,
Yep.
so I don't know if you wanted to talk about that.
Definitely. I think Ben made a good point. I just want to expand on this. The combinatorial explosion of testing that happens, right? When you do a stability study, you have to test your mAb, your conjugated drug substance, your drug product, and all the tests associated to it. The same for when you're doing comparability, you change something and you have all these explosions of testing that needs to happen, sometimes in different places too. That's also add to the logistics of making all this converge in time to meet your timeline. Maybe one more thing too is the bioassay strategy, right? Understanding your mechanism of action clearly and communicating this to the health authority sometimes takes more time than you think. There's often questions, and is the FC, as part of it or not? So that, you need to dedicate some time to think of it.
All right, great, thank you, Reza. I'm sure you have something to add to this as well.
I think Ben and Simon did a terrific job outlining some of the complexities here. I think one thing that we find sponsors tend to underestimate the time that it takes to do the work. If you ask me, like, for one thing, is that on the time, of course, the cost is an element as well, but these things are very time consuming, and you have to be very methodical in the way you do the work.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think it's probably even more so for ADCs than some of the other modalities that we talk about at Outsource Pharma. So yeah, thanks, Reza. So I think what you guys are talking about raises an important strategic question. So if sponsors are looking across that full value chain and seeing all of these complexity points, they also have to decide what they are truly willing to hand off and what needs to stay closer to home, right? So the next question I have, and Simon, let me start with you. What work or capabilities do you think ADC sponsors should keep or should fight to keep internal, if any, even if they plan to rely heavily on external partners?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not one size fits all answer in this case, right? Every sponsor have their different strength, weakness, and capabilities. So of course you need to take that into account. But generally speaking, you want to keep the science in-house and externalize the hands, the execution, right? The CQA frameworks, the critical quality attribute assessment, you want to do this, your reference standard, you want to own this and dictate how it's going to be managed. And if you have some, specialized assays that your DAR assay maybe, or if you have, it depends, right? Some sponsors don't have any analytical capabilities. Some have a little bit. From my background, I like to keep most of the mass spec in the house, just because you often have to reanalyze or sometimes a different set of eyes on your data will find something different. So I tend to trust my team more than the CDMOs usually for these specialized assays that I feel, the teams behind me have strong background.
I think that's a fair assessment. So Ben, what are your thoughts on here?
Yeah, I completely agree with Simon. I think there's no one size fits all, and sponsors do tend to lean into where they have the expertise. I take it a step further and to say, if you don't have the expertise, it's not a bad idea to call on a consultant, a little self-serving there, but to say that having somebody who knows that particular part and can be that second set of eyes on the mass spec data that is being generated. If you don't have that in-house capability, that goes a really long way. As the sponsor, it is ultimately your scientific judgment that should be used to drive the molecule forward. And if you hand that off to a CDMO, you will be in their very capable hands, but your interests aren't always aligned, or they may have a focus on a specific issue that they've seen in the past. And so it's always best to bring both of those sets of minds together and come up with the best path forward. But ultimately, sponsor, you're responsible for that scientific judgment and the control strategy that comes out of at the end of all this, as sort of Simon was hinting at with the analytical piece. So.
All right, thanks, guys. But so this internal versus external decision, kind of naturally leads into our next issue, or next question. Whether sponsors should be looking for one highly integrated partner or accepting that ADCs may require more distributed network. So Reza, I'm curious about the sort of one-stop shop promise from CDMOs. Do you think it's actually possible to keep a complex ADC program under one roof today, or is a certain level of vendor fragmentation just an unavoidable part of the deal?
Yeah, I think the best approach is to keep everything under same umbrella. I think that would give you the most, value, and it really creates the fastest timeline. Having said that, I think you can fractionate the supply chain. For example, you could make the map somewhere and the linker payload somewhere else, and then you would do the bioconjugation and fill and finish under one roof. So I think to do it in 4 different CDMOs would be very challenging. But what we often say, bioconjugation and the fill and finish, it's best to be done under same umbrella, because you really want to apply the same quality system, same testing, and so on. But if you could go to a one-stop shop, I think we highly recommend that in terms of creating the best value. But something that Ben and Simon said, which I really want to double click on, I think the sponsor must have deep understanding of the science and the technology and the regulatory framework for their ADC project. You cannot outsource that. You have to have a full understanding of that. You either have internal team, as Ben correctly pointed out, you could work with consulting companies that could provide you with that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, appreciate that insight too. Simon, I know that, or you and Ben probably both want to weigh in on this question. So I'll start. Simon, let's start with you. What are your thoughts on this?
I mean, yes, you're probably gonna go faster with one-stop shop and have a lot less headaches, right? This is clear, and for a lot of companies, this is very appealing. But there's various reasons, mitigate geopolitical risk or some contracts terms that might, affect your decisions to decide to fragment, to have certain pieces done at other places, right? In maybe a downside that I see is also, it can be maybe overwhelming, right? With a one-stop shop, you might feel like you're the small companies, it's your first biologic, and in some way it feels great to to be guided, but in some other way it might feel like you're losing a little bit of control. You're taken for a ride, and they know everything to do, and you're like, oh, okay, sure. So that's where also maybe the consultant might help to reassure the customer, the sponsor, to that things are right for them, or say something when they need to, there's a fork in the road that they need to consider.
Ben?
Yeah, I guess I would. I think I would say the same thing that both Simon and Reza already said. That it's appealing, right? Being able to manage all of this under one roof has a really strong appeal to it. I think the practicalities of it are often less smooth, but still strongly beneficial to the sponsor. So even within a single CDMO that is under one roof, you're dealing with different sites. You're dealing with different analytical groups and different manufacturing teams, different transfers that are still happening. You still need to know who's in charge of all of that, and you need to have a good project management infrastructure. And sometimes that's the CDMO. It's not a bad idea to have your own in-house person who's keeping track of all those things too. Some of these players, if you're a small company, don't have your own internal capability, you can get lost in the current. The program will move, and if you're not keeping up, it will keep moving, and it will come to a conclusion. But you own all the risk that built up over that time in the end. So I think in the end, the one-stop shops are there's only a few of them who do it under that sort of that named framework, and in most cases, you can get to a really good product really quickly at the end. Just make sure you keep eyes on it when that's happening. I've been a part of a few programs where we've had to dive in deeper at handoffs, and we'll talk a bit about that later, I think, about where the risk profiles live. But even within a one-stop shop, there are still handoffs. So it's about owning the overall program and the integration risk, and making sure that you're aware the CDMO is executing that transfer, the integration, but you're still as a sponsor accountable for it, even if it's under one roof.
Right. So I think that, it kind of leads into my next question, Ben. I'm going to stick with you on this to start off with, which is a little bit more about fragmentation, the sort of, I think because of there's, the fragmentation ideas, I think that more people are like, hey, how do we, manage this? So whether the fragmentation is, likely or unavoidable, something that we want to talk about, which you're starting to lead into, is accountability, and multiple partners are involved. Someone has to own the sort of quote unquote connective tissue of the program. So if you're working with like 3 different vendors for 3 different components, who is ultimately responsible for the glue that holds a program together? I think, you mentioned the drug sponsor there, but, and how do you ensure that the technical knowledge doesn't get lost in the gaps between the partners?
Right. Yeah. Sorry, I jumped the gun maybe on this question a little bit.
No worries.
Absolutely, the sponsor. It's there as the sponsor. You are the glue that holds it together. Even when the CDMO isn't under one roof shop, it's whether it's multiple CDMOs, whether it's one shop, whether it's one shop with one part pulled out to go to a central testing lab. These are all things that still, in the end, the sponsor, it's your molecule. You're the only one who knows and cares enough about it to make sure that your corporate goal is being met. Your deliverable of getting to this patient dose date is met. You're on the hook for it, and integrating those parts is part of your job as managing the CDMOs. The other part is the CDMOs, especially if you're not in a one-stop shop, they are not going to have access to all the information across the panel that you do. So you'll know things are happening in the antibody space, and your fill finish person has no idea, but that may really strongly impact how that assay transfer is going to go. And you know that, but they don't know that. And so if you're not integrating through a whole program view at the early stages, you're really at risk that something's going to bite you right at the very end. And I think the way that you keep those things from falling through the gaps is with really strong documentations, but also with having a strong internal program management framework that you can use. It doesn't have to be a person, but it has to be a framework where you're tracking things, where you're following up with vendors, and that you're making sure that they're connected to each other and the right people are.
Yeah, it's fair. Reza, what are your thoughts on this?
No, I think Ben did a terrific job again outlining this. I think the couple of things I would like to add is, one, you really need to have a fully integrated either internal team or a team of consultants that are true experts at every node of that supply chain. Linker, payload, analytical linker, payload, map, bioconjugation, drug product, and all the corresponding analytical functions that go with that. I think to me that's really critical. And really making sure the contracts that you're signing, either it's one CDMOs or multiple CDMOs, those contracts are structured as such. You have full visibility into the data, the know-how, and so on. Because sometimes CDMOs want to keep some trade secret in-house. And of course, it works really well for them, but it doesn't work well for the client, especially when it comes to regulatory filing. And if you plan to scale up or scale out the manufacturing process somewhere else. And we'll talk about this as we think about like China versus US. I think those are the elements to be mindful. Make sure the contracts are well written, that the client is fully protected.
Yeah, Agreed. Simon, anything else you want to add to that?
Yes, I mean, maybe add, reiterate on Ben's point that yes, the vendor is the glue, right? And how does the glue manifest itself, right? I think the first thing is a senior CMC program lead, right? Somebody who's going to be leading this company that has a broad and deep understanding of the program and CMC in general. Share technical risk registers, like where can it go wrong, and try to share this ahead of time and keep this live as we identify new risks. Joint development team meetings also, it's good to have everybody periodically together and discuss project milestones and how things are going. And also, finally, maybe an escalation pathway, right? What happens if there's a deviation, and who gets notified, and what is the sequence of action that will help put us back on track?
Yeah. So, Jeff, can I add one more thing, I think, to what we all talked about? When it comes to program acceleration, this is where the sponsor should have a full understanding of every element within the CMC. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to accelerate the program. You have to have a good understanding of the internal capabilities, internal understanding of the science and technology, and then how can you apply that to accelerate the program as the program moves forward.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So I think, in Ben's response, he kind of touched on a little bit about, documentation, which, leads us into the next question, which, because documentation is often where a lot of these handoffs either, can hold together or start to break down. So, Simon, let me go back to you. From your perspective, what does good ADC documentation look like in practice? And, if the goal is a smoother tech transfer and fewer surprises during scale up?
Yeah, I think the main thing for good documentation, as always, but especially for tech transfer, is if somebody, a new person that is kind of somewhat well versed in the art of what you're doing, can pick up the method and execute it without, having, holding in their hands to execute the method, right? So if the method is written with transfer in mind, right? Enough details that somebody new to this program can say, oh, okay, I know what to do. It's clear, and I can proceed with this. Another thing might be specification-wise, right? What's the rationale? Why do we have these specifications, and which critical quality attribute it's meant to control, right? That's always useful to bring this to CQAs. And force degradation studies to back this up too, right? The force deg will torture the molecule, elucidate the degradation pathways that will inform the specifications.
Now, Reza, I know you have tons of experience here and probably seen a lot of this. What's your thoughts on documentation? What do you see as being good documentation?
Yeah, I mean, Simon laid this out really well. What I would add to it is what we typically do for most of our clients, not for all, but for most, we establish an end-to-end CMC strategy to begin with. And then along the line, we would also establish a phase-appropriate execution plan. Why I'm pointing these things out is because you have to think about the phase of the program. You don't want to overinvest or underinvest in any given project. As Simon correctly pointed out, on CQA, CPPs, methods, specification, method development, those are all phase appropriate in the way we develop these. Otherwise, the client may end up spending way too much resources and, of course, money upfront for a program which has a high probability of clinical risks. And as such, we have to be very thoughtful about this. So what I would say, phase-appropriate documentation would go a long way. Comparability protocol, when you establish those, what do they look like? The test methods that you're doing along the way, they're all fully integrated.
All right, great. So, guys, we have a good question here from one of the audience members. Robert wants to know. He said, where does the panel believe the highest technical and regulatory risks are in the manufacture of ADCs? Anybody want to weigh in on that one?
Ben, why don't you take this first?
Sure.
I have my own idea, but you go first, please. Yeah.
I guess from a regulatory perspective, it a little bit depends on where your innovation is. So it's the regulators. If you're dealing with a new linker payload, that's absolutely where you need to focus most of your attention. The regulators know enough to know where there's going to be problems coming up there. But if your innovation for your ADC is on the protein end and you're driving longer PK and exposure time, then stability and plasma stability and overall product stability and handling become more important. So I'd say the biggest technical risk is in understanding your molecule's clinical profile before you even get to first in human, and putting all the effort into developing a process and control strategy at phase 1 that allows for that. Specifically in the linker payload space, though, I think that's where, for the most part, you need to know that part of the molecule as well as the biology and the antibody, and a lot of folks will choose to leave that part as managed by the CDMO. But the wrong impurity carrying its way forward ruins the whole package on the back end. So that's where I'd put it.
Yeah, Ben, you really are spot on when it comes to linker, payload, chemistry, and analytical methods. We often see that's being underestimated because people have historically used existing linker payload technologies, correct? And have applied that to a different antibody. What we're seeing now is truly novel linker payloads. Jeff, I would even take this a step further. There's a lot of work that has been done in DACs in addition to ADCs. And DACs are truly drug antibody conjugates where you're not dealing with a cytotoxic agent. You could be dealing with a small molecule, protein degrader. You could be even dealing with like a oligonucleotide that is linked to an antibody. We've seen all kinds of modalities through our consulting company. And just really understanding what the novelty is and focusing on that novelty. But if I had to give like a very high level answer, I totally agree with Ben. Linker payload, novel linker payloads are typically underestimated. And then the second place would be the bioconjugation.
Gotcha. Simon, anything?
Reza is spot on, right? And Ben is we understand the map pretty well. The old linkers, kind of, it's the new chemistry, right? That we all need to understand, and it might challenge also our analytical methods. So we might have to be creative with this, definitely.
All right, thanks, guys. And just as an aside, one of our polls, asked, when selecting ADC outsource partners, what matters most to the team, and most people responded that deep technical ADC expertise, was number one. So Reza, I think you kind of mentioned some of that as well too. So it's good. I think our audience is very in line with what you were saying as well. So good to know. So, we're talking about documentation, and, good documentation also has to support change, right? Because tech transfer in ADCs is rarely a clean one-time handoff. The program keeps evolving and the outsourcing plan has to evolve with it. So we often talk about tech transfer, as a one-time event, but ADC development, like I just said, is ongoing. So how do you build an outsourcing plan that's flexible enough to handle process optimizations that happen midstream? Reza, what do you think?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we often see clients that come to us and they've done a good portion of their work in early development in China, and then they want to take transfer to either a European or a US-based CDMO. And what we often tell them is make sure you have a very stable and well understood, well characterized manufacturing process before you think about tech transferring that. Because what the last thing you want to do is take an immature process and tech transfer it somewhere else. So just that deep understanding of every element of your manufacturing process and the critical quality attributes, I think it's a must. And once you have that, and then the tech transfer becomes a little bit less complex. But you have to be very thoughtful about every step of manufacturing. And then you may want to think about like tech transferring the bioconjugation and fill and finish first. So you basically are working backward, yeah, where you keep the map and the linker payload where they are, and then you do it in a sequential manner, but you work backward.
Gotcha. Okay.
That's what we typically recommend.
Ben, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think I fully agree. I think having a strongly understood process before you do any transfer is absolutely the baseline of what has to happen before you can move it. If you transfer something that's you don't know how it would perform if it hadn't been transferred, it's really tough to say that transfer didn't have an impact on the product quality. So then taking that the next step down, how do you know that it was reproducible? Well, you didn't run just one batch, presumably, then, right? You didn't just have a single data point to do that, which means you have to plan for additional batch work. You have to plan as though you're supporting a possible move or a scale up. So you have those pre-comparability change data points to compare against. So part of it is not overshooting on scale early on. Part of it is aiming for the right scale and understanding that batch data matters sometimes as much as the speed that went with or the clinical supply that went with selecting a certain batch size.
Yeah. Simon?
I think that one trap to avoid is very rigid contract, right? We might have to do, if you need to have to do one more batch or a little study here, to have flexibility in the contract to iterate and course correct as we do without this being cost prohibitive, right? Build a little bit of buffer in your contract to to prevent some iteration when it's needed, to allow some iteration if it's needed. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. And then, from the tech transfer stage, we can move, process evaluation to a step that can become a serious bottleneck if it's left too late, which is fill finish. Fill finish is highly specialized, especially for ADCs, and often overlooked until the last minute. So how early in the process should a sponsor be securing that partner to avoid a suffer later scenario at the end of the line? Reza, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I would say upfront, because if you think about fill and finish sites, those are the ones with the most quality and compliance issues. It's just the nature of the game, correct? You're doing sterile manufacturing, and FDA, EMA looks at those sterile manufacturing sites with the highest, what I would call quality and compliance requirements. You hardly ever get into trouble for your MAP or bioconjugation site or your drug linker payload, where you get most quality and compliance issues around fill and finish. So looking at those early on, and it should really not be an afterthought. And again, what we see, that's the most constrained supply chain today when it comes to ADC manufacturing.
Ben, did you want to weigh in on this one?
Sure. Yeah. I once again, Reza and I think are on the same page. I think it would be shocking if we weren't. I guess maybe getting this set up early is important, and being able to say that your DP manufacturer when you're talking with your DS manufacturer about process and specifications. And I think Reza mentioned it earlier. It's much more common to have your DS and your DP in the same spot because the analytics and the overlapping quality controls of both of those molecules are functioning the same. So I'd say getting in there as early as possible. And the other aspect here is maybe looking at liquid versus live is a pretty common question that people in the ADC space will have. And if you know already that your molecule is liquid stable, you have a lot more flexibility, but still limited flexibility because the DP landscape is still fairly condensed. If you need a lyo product, then you should be talking very early with any of these folks and getting that up and running quickly during your initial CDMO landscape reviews is probably the right time to have that. So,
all right, thanks, guys. Before we move to the to the next question. I got a question from from one of the audience members. Ash wants to know, and I don't know the answer to this, and maybe hopefully you guys do. But if not, we can always find out later. He wants to know if the drug is an already approved drug. Is the ADC a 505(b)(2) regulatory pathway? And you guys have any thoughts on that one?
What do you mean by drug? Are you referring to the map? Is that what he's referring to?
I would have thought, my first thought was maybe the conjugate, whatever it's conjugated to, but I don't know.
I mean, there are different, what I would say, mixtures, correct? There are cases where the linker payloads already been approved. There are cases where the map is already approved. So yeah, we have to be more specific. But in any case, if any of those are novel, if any elements of the ADC is novel, then that is a new NCE. It's not a 505(b).
Right. So since we've talked about a bunch of technical issues when it comes to ADCs and so forth, I'd like to widen the lens a little bit and bring in something that we hear a lot about in the news and we really can't get around. The sort of external environments, because the tariffs, the Biosecure Act, geopolitics are all increasingly part of ADC outsourcing strategy. So with that, with tariffs, the Biosecure and broader geopolitical pressure now being part of the planning environment, how much earlier do sponsors need to think about ADC outsourcing architecture than they did even 2 or 3 years ago? Ben, your thoughts on that?
I think 2 or 3 years ago there was a fundamental shift in when we have to do this, and it's now day one. It is you have an ADC and you plan on being in a global market at some point. You already need to be considering this. So now thinking about it isn't necessarily the same as selecting your final commercial configuration and location and infrastructure, but certainly knowing, for example, if you're going to do your entire manufacturing chain in China for a phase 1 study, that is a viable path to an approval. But you have to have a plan for if things change further under your feet between now and then, or things that we already know will be in place in 2030 that if you're going to be still manufacturing there. So all of the CDMOs that I know of are working to mitigate against these possible risks. And so working with your CDMO, but some of them it's by network support through other CDMOs. Some of it is by broadening their landscape. But you have to know what their capabilities are and how they would move your molecule from China to somewhere else, or the testing from China to somewhere else, so that your supply chain a year from now, 2 years, 5 years from now is not 2 years behind already. So I think it's now, like immediately.
Reza, I'm assuming that you agree with that, but maybe you want to add something else too.
I totally agree. I think Ben laid out a really good strategy here. And I would take one step further and start dissecting the question, because like a Biosecure Act, tariffs, and China, we often think about this in a blended fashion, but they're not one of the same. And Ben correctly pointed out, like what we do for many of our clients for earlier stage development, we may be in China, even for phase 1 up to phase 2. And as a program evolves into phase 3, and that's where you start creating what I would call some redundancy in the supply chain. And again, even in that case, you have to be very thoughtful and not create redundancy across every node of the supply chain. But we think about Biosecure Act as more of a focused issue, whereas tariffs are so broad and impacts reimportation in the US, regardless of where you manufacture it. And the whole geopolitical thing with China, it's often like there's more bark than bite, but that's something to be mindful of. The main thing is don't overreact. No knee-jerk reactions.
Right.
And that's what we're doing.
You led me into the next question really well, Reza. So stay with me here. I'll ask you first off. It kind of brings up this this difficult balancing act, right? I mean, we can't really talk about a lot of stuff without talking about China, and so sponsors clearly need to manage the China-related risk. But there's also, I think, like you alluded to, there's also a danger in overcorrecting, right? And creating a weaker and even more fragmented model. So what do you see as the bigger mistake right now? Staying too dependent on China or trying to de-risk too aggressively and creating a weaker, slower, more fragmented outsourcing?
Yeah, I think usually the push for these, what I would call redundancy away from China, comes from board of directors and the executive management who may not be as skilled in drug manufacturing and drug commercialization. So they really are pushing the tech ops team, well, give me a redundancy plan. I think for a small company, creating a redundancy plan actually creates more risks than benefits, because what you really are trying to do is a risk benefit management. But having more suppliers and more redundancy just creates a lot more risks for you. So we say, take a deep breath, think about where everything is, and there's always going to be time for us to transfer the program down the road. More you learn about the clinical profile of a given molecule, more resources and financial resources you want to allocate to the tech transfer.
Simon, what are your thoughts here?
Well, I think Reza said this very eloquently. I may add a few points to his comments, but essentially staying focused, right? I think if you start to look at alternatives all the time and you're on a very critical, short timeline to get to an IND, it might not benefit you too much I think maybe after you reach a certain milestone so you don't get distracted mid-course to those like externalization and get out of China or whatnot at this time, right? So again, there's no one size fits all, but generally speaking, early stage, you want to stay focused and reap the full benefit of the one shop stop, at one place.
Gotcha. Ben?
Absolutely. I think I agree with what I heard Reza say, that a lot of times this is coming from the board and from the executive management. And I think that's a really important factor here, is that they're doing it from a business risk and understanding perspective. And you need, as the owner of tech ops or as the owner of the supply chain, you may know more and you may be much more comfortable about the strategy and how you could do it. And so a lot of your job is then convincing of what the plan is. And so all of that comes back to, again, having a plan and no knee-jerk reactions. This is how we're going to respond. It will take this many years to do this. But when initially the Biosecure Act came out, there was almost a run on the bank kind of slots lockup happening globally, as people thought we weren't going to be able to work in China, and that has its own detrimental effect. Now you start committing to timelines and resources to transfer out that you didn't have to do then, but because there was this fear of a snowball, that sometimes that it actually was a self-fulfilling prophecy where a lot of folks ran into trouble with that. So I'd say the important part here is to move methodically, to move decisively, though, when you do decide to move. Your executive team well informed about why the risk profile is what it is at this moment, and what your risk profile would look like if you were to try to implement a change right now.
Great. And so I think, we've covered a lot of ground. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, too, maybe if you want to have a plan B, it's good to establish it from the very beginning. And even if you're not executing on it and saying, if, something goes terribly wrong or something changed, this is what we're going to do. But, not getting too distracted. And it's very important to keep the focus when executing.
So thank you, Simon. I appreciate it. I think most of the scientists in the audience would agree, plan Bs are always a good thing to have in your back pocket. I've done enough research, and we always need a plan B, right? So, we've covered a lot of ground, guys. And I think we could talk about this topic for, another few hours. But we've covered, complexity, partner models, documentation, fill finish, geopolitical risk. But as sort of like a final question before we get to maybe a few more specific questions from the audience, For a smaller biotech trying to build its first ADC outsourcing strategy, all of this stuff can feel, like a lot to manage at once. So if you could give one piece of advice to a smaller biotech that's currently building this, what would be the most important thing for them to get right on day one? Ben?
I think for me, it's going to be the investing in that internal CMC depth, whether that's through consultants or internal hires. I think you trying to have your head of research, who is a very skilled scientist, try to manage a strategic global network like this is a recipe for something getting missed. Whereas the experts who have done this over and over and over again, they're going to know where those pitfalls are. And so focusing internal CMC depth, especially, it is oftentimes a hard sell for a small biotech to say, why do we need a CMC hire at this point? But it is absolutely depth that, as we talked about with the CDMO management, you need that oversight of the CDMO's work so that you can have, ultimately, you own the data that comes out, you own the scientific aspects of the program. And so you need to understand what's happening and why the experiments are designed the way they are and what they're actually telling you. And then the other side of that coin, though, is you need to know the CDMOs that you're going to be working with. And so there's having that internal CMC depth. You also want to have a CDMO relationship network built when you go to start developing the actual product, so that you already have those relationships. You're not trying to start from zero and get it off the ground without having had several conversations with different CDMOs and understanding the landscape. That would be my advice to start.
Reza, I know you have some good advice.
No, I think Ben laid it out correctly. Make sure you work with high quality CDMOs to begin with. Make sure you have a full understanding of technology, operations, quality, and regulatory aspects of your project. And I think in most cases it's unrealistic to build a team within your tech ops so early in development. Unless you have 3 to 5 molecules, it's really hard to keep a fully, vertical team in place. And even that, you only have so much leverage over your CDMO network. So reaching out to appropriate people in the industry, people like Ben, would always be a great idea. And just complement your internal team. And this whole idea where the research stops and where development starts, we see this very often with many of our smaller clients. There has to be some distinction.
Right. Well, thanks, guys. We have a few minutes left, so we can maybe tackle one or two audience questions. And there was actually two folks, Michael and Robert, both had asked about IP. Like what are some IP considerations or limitations, constraints, and so forth. I didn't know if anyone had any. I know we don't have any lawyers on the panel at the moment, but I know you guys have been around this space for a while, and I don't know if there's anything you wanted to say about IP considerations. Whoever wants to jump in.
We do, Jeff. We do a lot of work in IP litigation and also IP prosecution for our clients. What I would say is make sure your IP is secured before you send any information to any CDMO, just to begin with. And then there's opportunities for creating additional IP around process itself that could be implemented for ADC. So I think there's tremendous opportunities for expanding your IP landscape, but make sure those things are secured before information is leaking out to any CDMOs, especially ex-US.
Makes sense. Anyone else want to chime in on that one?
I'll second that and just sort of add on to the last point that Reza made. The idea that you're going to get process patents out is a very real probability for anything you're developing in ADCs. Everything's a little bit nuanced here. So make sure that you're documenting all those email communications or minutes from meetings early on. Protect your IP before you send it and continue to protect it while you work with them so that your ideas are your ideas. And absolutely all those contracts should say that anything that happened on these calls is your IP anyway. So then make sure your contracts are set up to make sure that you own everything in the end as well.
Yeah, good point. Thank you for that, Ben. There's another very more specific question. Henry asked, he said, for CDMOs performing antibody drug conjugation or other bioconjugation type steps, Are these unit operations typically executed under full aseptic conditions, or are they generally run as controlled low bioburden processes? If anyone has any experience with that one and wants to chime in.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I would imagine in the beginning, not so much. And as you, but I'm more on the big molecule side. So maybe Ben knows better.
I've seen these much more commonly run as low bioburden processes, and less common as sterile processes. So it's pretty common to have a. I think at this stage, most CDMOs are more concerned about their operator being exposed to your product than your product being exposed to the operator at this stage.
Yeah.
But good EM is of course important. So.
No, you're absolutely correct. Yeah.
And then I think the last sort of technical question, again, if anybody wants to weigh on this one, from Robert, who asks, what freeze thaw challenges provide stability challenges of the bioconjugation of ADCs? Anyone have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I understand the question well, but I mean, if you have a frozen drug product and you have to do freeze thaw experiments, and then if you have a frozen DS, you also have to do freeze thaw experiments for the DS itself, which is not the final DP. I think that if that's what the question is, yes, you got to do freeze thaw experiments.
And maybe if you're looking for where the freeze thaw technically causes problems with ADCs, it's going to be the same place it causes for most proteins. It's going to be fragmentation, shear forces, pH gradients in your buffers. So there's honestly nothing special to ADCs in that space. Typically, it's much more just like a biomolecule stability concern on the freeze thaw.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe you have to worry about the payload falling off too. That's possible that it will an added element of fragility that you need to have your eyes on too.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much. I think that's a great place to wrap up. So again, thank you, Ben, Reza, Simon, so much for sharing, all of your practical perspectives on the decisions sponsors need to make early, more deliberately, and with clear view of downstream risk. I want to thank the audience for joining us today. Thank you for your questions. And also want to thank Lonza again for supporting this program and helping us make this discussion possible. So again, hopefully we'll see you at another Outsource Pharma Live in the near future, coming up soon. I think next month we'll have one early in the month, so stay tuned for that. But again, thanks to everyone, and have a great day.